So I was thinking, what's a story no one but me could possibly tell? Like, we have a much more vibrant Iranian-American community now than we did when I was growing up. It's kind of telling that this is literally the first time I thought that I could write about someone like me, and maybe someone will actually want to publish it.
Today, I'm talking to Adib Khorram. My name is Shah, and you're listening to Wits End. Adib Khorram is the writer of the YA book Darius the Great is Not Okay. It's about a half-Iranian kid who makes his first trip to Iran, where he visits family, and the trip ends up changing his life. It's really in-depth, it's really accessible, it's a really heartfelt book that dives into Iranian culture. Also, it's just a good time. Adib is the recipient of awards like the William C. Morris Debut Award, the Asian Pacific American Award for Young Adult Literature, and the Boston Globe Horn Book Honor, among others. I was glad to talk to Adib, looking forward to it, and during our conversation we talk about tea, Iranian culture, his books, the debut book, Darius the Great is Not Okay, his upcoming book, Darius the Great Deserves Better. Also, we talk about being honest about mental health problems and depression, and a lot more. If you dig this episode, I would appreciate a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a big help. But other than that, I'm going to let you listen to my conversation with Adib right now.
So I was thinking, what's a story no one but me could possibly tell? And I was like, I should write about someone like me, a family like mine. And it's kind of telling that this is literally the first time I thought that I could write about someone like me, because every book I had written before that was about, like, upper middle class white boys.
Yeah.
And, growing up I had never read about other Iranians, and so I'd just kind of been erased from my imagination. But when I started working on Darius was also when the We Need Diverse Books movement was really taking off. For those unfamiliar, it's an organization founded by a bunch of authors of color to basically shift the culture of children's publishing to stop being so white and straight and able-bodied and cisgendered. And so I was thinking, well, maybe I should write a book about me, not me, like literally, but a book about someone like me, and maybe someone will actually want to publish it. Mm-hmm. And I very quickly decided that I was going to have Darius traveling to Iran, because I've never been and I've always wanted to go, and I don't think I'm going to get to go. And so writing about it was kind of a way of taking myself on that trip. And it was a way of kind of distilling the feeling that I had about, like, visiting my family and then having to say goodbye, and kind of honing it into a singular moment where Darius was literally going to be visiting for the first time and maybe for the last time. And so it just kind of intensified everything.
That's really interesting, though, how you didn't visit, but I was wondering, did you do research by talking to family members, or was it just, like, reading books and, like, doing deep dives online or something?
Oh, yeah, I talked to all my family members, got them to give me old stories and photographs. I do still have a few cousins, and one, Amu and Zanamu, that live in Yazd still, and I got them to send me photographs. I did read a lot of books, and I read a lot of travel blogs from, non-Americans who are actually able to visit Iran. And, granted, lots of Americans can and do visit Iran, but there's always kind of some element of risk. Mm-hmm. And I also discovered that Google Street View had been through the streets of Yazd, and so I spent a lot of time just clicking through and seeing, a Google Street View of Yazd, which was really awesome. So thanks, Google.
What blew my mind the first time I read it was that my grandmother is from Yazd. Like, her name is Yazdan Padast.
Wow, I wonder if your family knows my family.
I guess that's another kind of, not exactly stereotype, but it's like a joke where it's like everyone kind of knows each other in Iran. Like, everyone's so close.
It is kind of a joke. And it's one of those jokes that you're always like, well, we don't all know each other. And then I literally once had someone tweet at me out of the blue and be like, hey, does your dad know my dad? And so I texted my dad, and sure enough, they had gone together in second grade back in Yaz. And I was like, apparently our dads do know each other. So, it's all, I guess, 6 degrees of separation. It's kind of hilarious when you do find those connections.
Yeah, I mean, we'll be visiting my grandmother, and then, like, someone will come on TV, like, we'll be watching a movie, and they'll be like, yeah, your uncle went to school with that actor. It's just like, I'll take your word for it, I guess.
That's amazing.
You mentioned something earlier, like the erased from my imagination thing. Yeah, I get that. Like, there are moments where you're looking around for people from your culture, like, even if you're watching a TV show and someone has, like, an Iranian name, if their name is, like, Amir or something, you're like, holy shit, you get excited, because, like, you don't see too much of that. So, like, when there's a story that's just full-blown, like, embracing Iranian identity, it's super unique. Were there any, like, books, movies, TV shows, just, like, little things that you were like, this is Iranian, like, I can kind of accept that in pop culture?
Nothing that I can really think of growing up. And even today, there's not a whole lot. I'm more aware of it in the book sphere, just because that's where I am, and so I'm more familiar with other Iranian authors that are working today. And there's, like, a whole bunch of us in Kidlit now, which is really exciting. And I've also been watching What We Do in the Shadows, the TV series, and I've been really excited to see an Iranian actor playing an essentially Iranian character and even speaking Farsi sometimes.
I need to watch it now. So
you haven't seen What We Do in the Shadows?
I haven't. Okay, I love the original movie. Like, it's one of my favorite movies ever, but, like, I keep putting it off.
Is played by an Iranian actor, and since he's, like, 700 years old, they made up a tiny country that's in modern-day Iran for him to be from. And he, like, has an Iranian accent, and he sometimes speaks in Farsi, though he doesn't call it Farsi, because he, says it's Al-Khanadari's. I don't know. The made-up country is really hard for me to say, because I don't speak Farsi anyway. And it has, like, all of the sounds from Farsi that I have a hard time making. But it's absolutely delightful. He's not, like, a villain any more than any of the other vampires are villains. I don't know, it's really refreshing to see basically any Iranian character that's not being a terrorist or kind of just a villain in general.
Yeah, don't you get tired of that?
I do, especially because, I mean, like, more terrorism is committed by angry white men with guns than by Iranians. Mm-hmm. Like,
yeah, it's
way more to be afraid of from the red hat wearing crowd than there is of me and people like me.
Yeah, it's like one of the dark sides of nationalism, where it's the ignorance of not wanting to just learn about other cultures. It's just they're from a different culture. That means they're a threat. It's just like there's more to people than that. You can't just, like, paint them as villains just because you don't understand or, like, they're not familiar to you.
Yeah, and I do think people are generally certainly afraid of what's different. But I think also people are often afraid to admit when they don't know something, and it's easier to just say, I do know, and it's bad, rather than taking the time to find out for themselves.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering, growing up, what were, like, the little, I guess microaggressions would be the word. What were, like, the little kinks that you would bump into on a regular basis? Like,
ooh, I mean, the one that really sticks out is I was in high school when the September 11th attacks happened, and I did get called a terrorist quite a bit after that. Before that, I don't know, like you said, a lot of it was just a name thing. People could pronounce, Michelangelo and would stumble over Adib. And, like, I say Adib, most of my Iranian family says Adib, but I don't know. I mean, my mom is white, and I think she also had an easier time with Adib. Mm-hmm. And so that's just kind of how both my parents refer to me, and that's how I think of myself. Growing up in the suburbs of Kansas City, I think I performed whiteness as best as I could. Mm-hmm. And so I think, I avoided a lot of stuff simply by not claiming my own identity. But B, I probably also suppressed when I was being I don't know, it's really hard to grapple with when you're younger as well, because so much of your adolescence is spent trying to fit in as much as possible and to be kind of violently singled out in that way. Maybe violently isn't the right word, but
I mean, like, yeah, I mean,
very singled out in that one way. Is really painful.
Was there ever a time where you just stopped caring, or like it just didn't bother you, where it's like, I don't have to try to blend in as much anymore?
I think it was actually when I went away to college, and I went to study theater at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, which was like 4 hours away from home. Basically just on the other side of the state. Mm-hmm. And so I was like away from home, but it wasn't like I was across the country. But being on my own and being around a bunch of theater kids, and theater kids are generally unabashedly themselves when they're not being other people. Yeah. Made me feel a lot more comfortable with being myself, and being Iranian is one of the things that set me apart. And like not having any family around to celebrate Nowruz with or go and eat Iranian food with made me want to share that with my friends in a way that I never had before. And so that really brought me a lot closer to my own Iranian-ness. And so I also think in general, like being out of my teen years, like once I hit my 20s, I just generally had less fucks to give. Like I ran out of fucks in university, and that also kind of helped me claim my own identity better.
I kind of wish I talked to you when Nowruz was happening this year, because like there was
the saddest Nowruz I have ever had.
Yeah, I still jumped over the fire though. I still did Charshambe Suri.
I had a little candle and I put it in my kitchen, which has I guess laminate floors, something. It seemed fireproof enough to light a candle and jump over it.
It's cultural. It's fine. It's
right.
Yeah. How was that? Because I'm with you. It was compared to all of the Nowruz celebrations I had. This was the one where it's just like,
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of phone calls and a lot of FaceTime with different family members. I made a big pot of fessenjun for myself and my sister and my mom, who did end up coming over. Just kind of the three of us. We formed our little isolation cluster. And my tahdig turned out terribly. But whatever. These things happen.
It's tahdig. Everyone, it's good, like, either way.
This is fair. And I think we just watched a movie or something and drank some wine. And yeah, Nowruz was like a few days after Kansas City issued its stay-at-home order. Mm-hmm. And so just like we were all still reeling and trying to figure out what the quarantine times were going to mean.
Yeah, so you mentioned cooking. Like, I cook Iranian food occasionally, but I was wondering, like, was it self-taught, or was it like you try to pull the family recipe out from like your grandmother or father or something?
A lot of it I reference New Food of Life, which my Amme got me way back over 10 years ago, and it's very dog-eared and beaten up. Mm-hmm. But that's where I get a lot of recipes from. And my grandmother, we called her Khorram. She did not really like to cook. She was kind of terrible at it. But my Amme was a fantastic cook, and still is a fantastic cook. And so I would kind of try to get recipes out of her, and that never quite worked because she would always leave things out. And so I would try to watch her or help her when she makes things and find all the little things that she did but didn't bother to like mention when she was telling me the recipe. And yeah, there's certainly been a little bit of like experimentation and disaster as well.
Yeah. It's like it always feels like you can never get the family recipe, or like whoever you're trying to, copy, you can never get that right.
Right. Also, like, I do think a big part of it is my aunt has access to a very large herb garden, so all of her herbs are always fresh. She also has a gas stove, whereas mine is electric. I don't know. There's also just something special about when your family is making it.
Mm-hmm.
A, it makes so much food, and I live by myself, and B, it always takes so long. I don't make it that often because I just don't have the time, and I don't know what to do with all the leftovers. Like, if you have a big family around, food becomes a little bit more of a planned thing, and so you can also, like, cook in the morning and let it stew all day, and then it's delicious by the afternoon, as opposed to starting it at 4 and panicking that it might not be ready by 7, which is how my Iranian cooking usually goes.
So you mentioned Kansas City. I was wondering, is there a big Iranian population there, or was it just like, I feel like I'm the only one?
I used to feel like I was the only one. Certainly when we were younger, my dad knew a few other Iranian families, and we would see them fairly frequently, but there was like 3 or 4 other families. And now there's quite a few more, a much more vibrant Iranian-American community now than we did when I was growing up. Mm-hmm. But I'm also like a little less connected to it, just because like my dad doesn't live here anymore, and they were all his friends, not my friends.
Yeah.
But it's nice to know that they're all there. That being said, we also, I don't know, we don't really have like a really good Iranian restaurant in town right now. Last I checked, I couldn't find a good one, and I was very disappointed when my favorite one closed several years ago. I also don't have a grill, and sometimes I just really crave cello kebab.
Exactly. And, like, making it at home is never the same. I don't know what they do. Like, when you go to an actual Iranian restaurant, they, like, do it a certain way where it's, like, euphoric.
Mm-hmm. Well, they have all that industrial cookware, and everything is already well seasoned, like the pans and stuff, in a way that you just can't really get at home.
What's your go-to, other than kebab, because that's, like, everyone's favorite?
I love fesenjoon. Mm. I love khoresh karafs. And I also have a soft spot for cutlets. Like a big pile of cutlets and make a bunch of sandwiches out of them.
All of those were, like, unexpected, too. It's not like ades polo and khoresh bademjoon.
I hate eggplants. Also, anything with zereshk. I love them. I love zereshk polo. I love basically anything you can stick barberries in, like, sign me up.
Yeah, but cutlet is definitely one of my top. Yeah, like you said, you can make sandwiches and you can just eat them, like, whenever. Mm-hmm. And also you make a lot, so you can just eat them for a week, which really makes me want to go make them right now, so.
I have never actually made them. That might be a project at some point. It's just, like, it's so involved.
Yeah. It's way easier than kebab, though. I've screwed up kebab more than I've done cutlet, but, like, cutlet is manageable. Was tea drinking something you had to get used to, or was it just like, no, I'm going to embrace this?
I definitely embraced it, but when I was a child, I certainly used a lot more sugar. Mm-hmm. And now I pretty much never add sugar to my tea. But I was always enamored of it. And because I don't speak Farsi, I think, actions were something that I absorbed about our culture more so than the language. Mm-hmm. And just the ritual of bringing someone tea when they came over, and of, like, every morning starting the kettle and refilling it throughout the day. Those were things I was associated very strongly with my family. And so I wanted to be part of that in whatever way I could. And drinking the tea and eventually learning how to make the tea were kind of my way of doing that.
Yeah, and one of my favorite parts from your book is the conversation that you have to damn it. That is a conversation I've had before. Like, that was, I sent that page to my mom. I was like, doesn't this look familiar? But where did that come from? Like, was that a conversation that you had, or was it, like, based on stories that you got from family members?
Many of my aunts and uncles have all made the damn it with hell joke at some point or another. And so I just kind of always knew I would be incorporating that joke. And as far as, like, that very specific scene are you talking about where Babu is teaching Darius how to, like, make the tea even though he already knows, right?
Yeah.
I don't remember. I feel like maybe that has happened to me before. It feels like the kind of thing that probably has at some point or another with my various far-flung relations. But I also think as, as children of diaspora, so often adults don't always know what you know, and will sometimes try to be helpful in a way that ends up being a little bit hurtful. Just because, when you already feel disconnected to your culture, and then someone tries to educate you on the few ways that you already do know your culture, it just, I don't know, makes you feel very invalid.
Yeah, I mean, you said it. It makes you feel unheard.
I once heard someone say that when you're biracial or bicultural, you're not half and half, you're whole and whole. And my feeling growing up, and sometimes to this day, is that I wasn't whole and whole, I was none and none, just because I didn't really belong in either space. And the spaces I most belonged to were the spaces of other, like, biracial kids, whether they were Iranian or not. There's a kind of shared experience of being not quite enough that so many of us have. And particularly as an author of books for young readers, I do feel a responsibility to claim that, to claim my identity in a very visible way, so that ideally young people now, whether they're Iranian-American or kind of any other community, will have an easier time of it than I did. And I think for the most part, those of us who do make children's books are in it because we do want to make the world better for young people. And so I think I take that pretty seriously, that responsibility.
There was something I wanted, like, based on that, there was something I wanted to ask you earlier when we were talking about Nowruz, but if, like, people you knew read the book, would they be like, oh, okay, I understand that thing that you were talking about? Like, did it familiarize them with the culture in any way, like, make it more accessible?
I do think so. During, actually, the editing process, that's something my editor and I talked about a lot. My editor is actually Lebanese-American, and so she had a lot of kind of very similar touch points. And there was a lot of back and forth on, how much do we want to show? How much should Darius explain? How much do we just need to let the readers infer or go do the research themselves? Because we were very conscious of wanting to really center Darius's perspective and Darius's story. But the white gaze is also inescapable. And so we did have to kind of reconcile that. And yeah, it's been really interesting to see the things that people have come away understanding better from the story. And also really cool to see people, like, to get emails from people or talk to people who are like, oh, I didn't really understand this, but I looked it up and I thought it was so cool. Or I didn't really understand, this. But in my culture, we have something similar, I think. And so that's been really cool to see the way people have connected with it.
Earlier, you were talking about how people would read the book and they would say, this isn't exactly how things are in my culture, but I know something similar. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but there are certain things within cultures, not like strictly just Eastern or strictly Western, but like across the board, there are things that are just similar in the way people, I don't know, like in the way cultures work.
Oh yeah, for sure. It turns out a lot of other cultures also Tarof. They just don't call it that.
Yeah.
And that's been really amusing to see. And a lot of them also don't have a specific word for it the way Farsi does. And so it's been really fun to talk to people about that.
Did you Tarof? Was it something like growing up, you would do it and people would be like, what the hell are you doing? Just like walk through the door. We don't have to have an argument about this.
I did not understand it growing up. One of my cousins finally had to explain what was going on to me because I just didn't get it. I always just, like, yes or no answers were all I ever gave and all I ever took. And, like, I'm sure I vexed my relatives, and my relatives certainly vexed me. And yeah, so it wasn't until I was probably in my teenage years that someone finally explained to me why people would always offer me things 3 times or would force me to do something that I didn't want to do just because they thought they were being polite and didn't realize that I didn't know how to tar rope. And so when I said no, I just literally meant no. Yeah, I do think, I mean, being from the Midwest, we have our own like mild version of that. But it's certainly not at the level that Iranians perform it at. And I have found myself doing it a little bit more as I get older. Mm-hmm. I think not to the extent of any of my like Iranian relatives, but I do like double check. If someone says they don't want something, I'm like, are you sure? But I generally like double check is it, and then I move on. I don't like quadruple check.
Yeah. Star Trek was another big part of the book. I'm just going to assume that you're like a lifelong Star Trek fan.
That would be correct.
Yeah. I mean, it is actually one of my favorite parts, how like they have that tradition of watching Star Trek. Like even when they go to Iran, they have the iPad and they watch it. Was that something that you did growing up?
It was. Every Thursday, I would go over to my grandma's, and we would watch new episodes of Star Trek: The Next Generation as they came out. Mm-hmm. And I actually didn't think about that memory very much when I was like creating the story. The main thing was really just this really kind of sobering moment I had early on in the writing, where I was just doing a little math and figuring out people's birthdays, and I was like, oh, I'm actually closer in age to Stephen than I am to Darius. And I had a minor meltdown about just kind of the marching of time and feeling like I was getting old. And I actually really do like getting older as someone who grew up like with depression and thought I wasn't going to survive high school. Like making it to my 30s is awesome. I love my 30s, but it was still like this sobering moment of, oh, I'm not a kid anymore. And that really got me thinking about what would happen if I was a parent. And I was like, oh, I'd probably make my kids watch Star Trek with me. Darius's dad probably makes him watch Star Trek with him. And that's really how the whole thing was kind of born. And it was only after I had started writing about it that I remembered, like, my Thursdays with my grandma. And I was like, oh, everything old is new again. I don't know. I think, though, the way that we all move through time is something that fascinates me. And the way that we change as we grow up is super interesting to me. Yeah, because, like, I'm not the same person I was 2 years ago, much less 10 years ago, or, now I have to do math. Like 20 years ago. Oh, my God. It's been 20 years since I was 16. Wow. It's so funny. I do a lot of school visits, and one of the things I get asked fairly frequently is teens will often ask me, if you could go back and change one thing, what would it be? And I always say I wouldn't change anything because I like where I am now, and I had to go through all the shit to get where I am now.
Yeah.
And that's not even like taking into account the dangers of time travel in general. But yeah, I think, though it's been painful at times, like, life and growing up has been mostly rewarding. I think that's a really valuable message to get out there. I don't know, message feels very like after school especially. In general, like our society is so afraid of getting older, and I have actually very much enjoyed getting older and letting go of unimportant things and discovering what's truly important.
Yeah, I'm with you. Like, my general disposition is like 80-year-old George Carlin. So
I love George Carlin. I miss him.
Do you ever think, like, what would, like, guys like George Carlin or Bill Hicks be like if they were still around? Like, what would, like, I want to see what kind of shit they would come up with about, like, how everything is at the moment.
Right? I bet George Carlin could.
Can we give them...
capture this presidency's spirit really eloquently in words that you're not allowed to say on television.
There's another thing that people are not very comfortable talking about openly, and, like, I'm still working on it, but it's depression. And, like, how did you deal with it? Because, like, even now, even when people are more aware of it, it's still difficult to talk about. It makes people uncomfortable.
My family has kind of a long history of mental illness. My mom's side of the family. And so when I started kind of showing signs of depression around like age 12 or so, my mom very quickly knew to deal with it. And I think having seen the repercussions of handling it poorly in some of her relatives, several of whom have died by suicide, she was quite determined that that was not going to happen to me. And so she made sure I was getting therapy and made sure I was getting medication when I needed it. And so I actually grew up very comfortable talking about it. And so it kind of surprised me to find out that other people weren't comfortable and didn't know how to talk about it, especially like the Iranian side of my family. And just Iranians in general kind of don't like to talk about mental illness.
Yeah.
And so I was very aware of the conflict there. And also, just like as a writer, I was very aware when I started writing Darius in 2015 that 2013 and 2014 had seen a whole bunch of books in the young adult space come out about either the aftermath of suicide, of people dying by suicide, of people doing revenge suicide. And I felt that those were all like really sensationalized and romanticized and just like icky narratives. And I really wanted to get a different narrative out there. And be like, hey, like depression is more than just wanting to hurt yourself. Depression is something that you can live with and have a very fulfilling life with. From very early on in the process, I knew I wanted to explore it in a way that like made it not an issue.
Is that something, like when you go to school visits or you give talks, is that something that people bring up?
A lot of people talk about it. And it's actually kind of weird because I sometimes get asked to like talk more in depth about it. Like I am not a doctor and I'm not a psychologist. I'm very comfortable talking about my own experiences. But when people are like, can you give me advice? It's like, I'm not sure I can give advice. I'm not sure it's responsible for me to give that advice because I don't ever want to do harm. Mm-hmm. So it's been really challenging at times to figure out where to draw my own boundaries on that and still feel like I'm supporting people as best I can.
From your experience or your opinion, I'm not asking you to give like medical advice, but how do you think we can deal with it effectively?
I think part of it is we need structural change in like our healthcare system. Aside from, treating healthcare like, something that everyone deserves instead of a for-profit business, that would help things. Yeah. But moving beyond my passion for Medicare for All, I also think like so many health insurers don't cover therapy or only cover like, you can go to therapy for 8 weeks and then it's all out of pocket the rest. Making it hard to get access to mental health resources makes it harder to just talk about mental health in general. I was actually talking with a couple other authors last night about the way that the pandemic is kind of raising awareness of mental health issues. And our hope that as we see more celebrities like Michael Phelps opening up about it, maybe we'll see some positive change. But also, I'm kind of wary of the language of mental health getting co-opted, as kind of so often happens when we bring awareness to issues, that people are going to start saying, using terms like depression when they really just mean that they're sad or bummed out.
Yeah.
And that some of these things are going to lose their meaning. I don't know. It's fraught. One of the things that I am really excited about now is the rise of like talk therapy and like online therapists where you can Skype with a therapist and not have to leave your own home. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really cool and kind of broadening accessibility for a lot of people.
Do you think, personally, I don't think that there should be any stigma behind, talking to a therapist, but do you think that like the online conversations cut down on any stigma?
I think I think they do in some part, because they allow people to kind of come at it at their own pace and in their own space. And when you're kind of alone, in your room on your laptop or whatever, you're not having to go into an office and have other people look at you. And I think the perception of other people judging you is one that can be really hard to shake, especially if you're dealing with mental illness. Mm-hmm. And especially if you're younger and dealing with the invisible audience that you kind of have in your head when you're an adolescent. I think that can make things a lot easier.
I guess on a broader scale, it's give a shit about people and also be more empathetic.
Mm-hmm. It's funny how often those two little things would pay big dividends in making the world better.
It's one of those like deep rooted things that we need to focus on, but they get swept under the rug for like nonsense. The president's like chugging Clorox or whatever the fuck, and
oh, what a nightmare. Yeah, I do feel like so often there's a dearth of empathy in our world. But also, like, I feel like a lot of that comes from older people. And that so many of the kids and teens and younger people that I meet are way more engaged in the world and way more empathetic than I ever was at that age, and the people around me were. And that does give me a little hope that, assuming, we don't broil ourselves in the self-cleaning oven that is the earth, that maybe things are going to get better.
So, are you hopeful?
Usually. There are definitely days where I definitely feel knocked down by the news. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, I do think I'm hopeful. I'm also, I'm both hopeful for the future, but also, I think, weirdly fatalistic in that, as much as I hope and think that we will make a better world, sooner or later the sun is going to explode and incinerate everything. And so at the end of the day, maybe the next species will do better.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to Darius. I was wondering if you can talk about the upcoming book, Darius the Great Deserves Better.
Oh, sure. So it picks up 6 months after the end of Darius the Great is Not Okay. It finds Darius back in Portland, living his life. He is now a junior in high school. He is on the varsity soccer team. He is interning at his favorite tea store, and he is dating a boy named Landon. And he has more or less gotten everything that he always thought he wanted. And despite all that, his family is struggling a little bit to financially recuperate from an overseas trip. His grandfather's health is still declining. Mm-hmm. And to kind of, both of his parents are working a lot of overtime, and so to help out, they have Darius's grandmothers, Stephen's moms, come and help out, and Darius doesn't really get along well with them. And over the course of the book, Darius kind of learns how to speak up for himself and what he wants, and B, how to redefine what he wants the future to be, because just because he got what he wanted doesn't mean it was what he really wanted.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you have anything else you want to throw out there. You have the new book coming out in August, but if there's anything you want to toss out. I
also have a picture book about Nowruz coming out February 16th of 2021. So if you have any kids or any Iranian children in your life, you should absolutely pre-order that picture book for them. It's called 7 Special Somethings, A Nowruz Story.
I love that. I'm into it.
Really excited. I myself, most of my cousins have little kids right now. Some of them have older kids. And so they're a little out of the age range for it, but a lot of them are in the 5 to 7 range. And I'm just really excited to be the cool cousin who wrote a book about Nowruz that they can take to school. It's going to be great.
You can find all of Adib's information in the description of the episode. His Twitter and Instagram are both at Adib Khorram. His website is adibkhorram.com. Check out his book, Darius the Great is Not Okay. Be on the lookout for his upcoming book. Darius the Great deserves better. I do want to note that this conversation was recorded before the George Floyd protests. That's why they're not coming up in the conversation, but in the upcoming conversations that I have, we have a few discussions about the murder of George Floyd, and I do want to put that out there. But as always, you can follow me on Twitter @_ShawComics. You can follow the podcast on Twitter @WitsEndPod. You can check out my Instagram @Shaw_comics. I just post whatever comics I'm reading at the time. And be sure to check out witsendpod.com. I have full episodes, reviews, write-ups, gets updated regularly, just a lot of comics and pop culture stuff. And if you have a quick second, I would appreciate a rating or review on iTunes. It would be a big help. Aside from that, thank you for listening. Stay safe, take care of yourself and your loved ones.